This is Candid Conversations with Dr. Mayfield, a podcast that resources families and friends with tools to have important conversations about mental and emotional health. This show is sponsored by Mayfield Counseling Centers, helping you find clarity, hope, and purpose. Here's your host, Trevor Sheeran.
Thank you for joining us on Candid Conversations. We are so glad to be joining you today with a new intro. We've gotten a lot of feedback that people didn't really enjoy the last intro, so change it up.
We're listening.
Today we're talking about homeschool and public school, and this is another listener request for us, which is really cool. We're really excited to be able to hear from you.
Absolutely.
I've been working on some blog posts revolving around our first few episodes. And one of our first conversations
a year ago.
Was a year ago. And we were talking about how to have a conversation. And one of the big points was a conversation is not about being right or proving the other person wrong. Mm-hmm. It's about understanding. And I think that's something that we're going to be working through today because you homeschool your kids. Mm-hmm. My wife's a public school teacher. I was homeschooled and then public schooled. So there's a lot of different dynamics.
You were homeschooled, private schooled, then public schooled, right?
Well, I count the private school as public, which is probably wrong.
Right, okay.
But close enough. So let's dive into this discussion.
Love it.
Homeschooling is?
Homeschooling, well, I'll be honest, homeschooling has had a bad rap over the decades, but homeschooling for us is we join a co-op in town where we meet with other families. We have the biggest co-op in actually El Paso County. We have like 30 or 40 families that come together across different age groups, even more than that, I think. And they have tutors, and each kid is broken up into classes. And once a week, they focus on the curriculum that's at hand. And it's a classical type curriculum. So it's like the charter school, TCA, classical academy. But it's focusing in on the learning styles specific for the student versus kind of fitting that mold. And we chose that specifically for our girls because of their giftedness and kind of the different attentions. They're way ahead on some things and kind of behind on others. And, we're able to have that freedom. So once a week for 24 weeks, we are a part of a co-op. And then the rest of the time it's kind of self-learning through our curriculum, through Becca, and through which is part of the curriculum. And there's different types of writing and math and all that kind of stuff that we do at home.
Do you use any of the Sunlight curriculums?
I don't think so. I don't think we like those very much. Based on I could be wrong, and my wife could be listening to me right now, rolling her eyes. Going, you have no idea what you're talking about. But the biggest thing is for us, it was just what was the best for our kids.
Yeah, which I think is a common thread in a lot of homeschooling is child-centered, trying to find the best solution for that child for that moment.
Well, and for us, it's not grade-driven, right? So our my oldest goes, "What's a grade?" Like we probably should teach her a little bit because for prep, college prep and that kind of stuff. But it's not grade driven. It's mastery driven. So do you understand the concepts? Can you regurgitate that? Can you bring it back to us versus getting a certain score on a test or a paper or that kind of stuff?
Yeah. So. And I mean, for me, I was struggling a lot with ADHD and dyslexia, and so there was a learning disability and a behavioral issues. And so if I had been in a public school, I would have been expelled pretty quickly.
Sure.
And so homeschool is really one of the only good options for me. And I think I hear that a lot of we want to make sure that our kids are getting what they need. Mm-hmm. I also hear a lot of, and I think this is some of what gives homeschool a really bad rap, is the overprotectiveness of I can protect my child from all of the evils of a public school, and it's this very good versus evil language.
Yeah, I think that's in some ways. I think that's been the excuse of many for so long, and I think there's some truth to that to some degree. Especially if we just looked at the bill that just got passed, in Colorado for comprehensive sex education starting in like kindergarten. like, okay, I want to make sure that I have control over those kinds of things. Age appropriate, like we talked about,
Yeah.
7 or 8 episodes ago about age appropriate conversations with our kids.
Yeah.
I don't want the school having that kind of conversation with my kid, right? So I want to make sure that I have control over that. But as far as protectiveness goes, I think you're right. I think the persona of homeschooling has been, the Tim Hawkins homeschoolers song, or we assume that everybody's going to wear these Birkenstocks and long skirts and have their hair up in buns, and they don't know how to socialize,
which a lot of them do at the conferences.
Well, yes, and that's not been our experience with it, but I think for us it was purely an educational decision. And we really have our kids engage in other social outlets, whether it be at church, or whether it be in the community, whether it be through extracurricular stuff. But it wasn't the decision based on the protectiveness is so much as it was, our oldest was reading by 3.
Yeah.
How would a school accommodate that so she's not bored and getting in trouble because she's bored, those kinds of things.
Well, and you touched on something that I think is really important, and we talked a little bit about this in our episode about Rue last week. And my wife is a teacher for high school, teaches math, and a lot of the feedback she gets from students is that they wish they would teach on how to do taxes, or how to change a tire, budgeting, stuff like that. And what we've kind of come to as a couple in our conclusion is that's not the role of the teacher, that's the role of the parent. But since the parent is slowly fading away, in a really general sense, it is becoming the school's mandate to fill the gaps in education. And I think that's why we see the sex education, one of the reasons we see sex education becoming younger and younger in public schools, or RU, or a lot of schools are starting to have options for seniors where they spend a week. Excuse us, our GoPro is being really annoying, so we're going to turn that off. A lot of seniors have the opportunity to, before school or after school on a certain day, go out to the parking lot and learn how to change a tire, or learn how to change oil, or learn how to do budgeting. And so they're teaching these life skills. And I think some of that is just because there aren't parents who are teaching that as intensely as we need.
Well, and part of the reason we chose to homeschool too is I want to equip my family, my kids, to be the best societal, to be best prepared for society, to be, kind. And, I think it's a lot of things went into this, right? And that's why I would encourage parents that are listening going, take a step back, I think, and don't have that I should, this should, the shoulds narrative in your mind. Well, I should send my kid to public school. Well, why? I don't know. Or I should send them to private school. I don't, there's no shoulds. I think you take a look at your kid, and every kid's going to be different, right? Not every kid in a household should be homeschooled, or should be in public school or private school. It needs to be, and that's where I think we get caught up in these societal, shoulds and musts, in the ways that these almost what I'm looking for, like molds or models that they're supposed to be in, and we don't really take a unique look at the kid themselves.
Yeah.
And so it's funny because people, when they find out we homeschool, like, oh, you don't like public school? Like, no, I never said that.
Yeah, because it seems like this us versus them mentality.
Right. Yeah, and I always say, like, I never said I don't like public school. I said, this is the best decision for my girls. But, if we end up having another kid and it's, whatever, we'll look at that scenario too and go, what's the best for them? But yeah, I think you're right. It becomes, but this is the complacency of our society, right? It becomes us versus them, or and that's where I think a lot of the misunderstanding comes. Because then there are a lot of people that have, I've met a lot of people, I'm sure you have too, that say they homeschool, and I'm like, no, you don't. You don't do anything.
Right.
Like, you just let your kid do whatever they want, whenever they want, and however they want it, and they're not learning a jack,
Yeah. Well, I know of one couple that chooses to let their children discover what they want to learn, rather than teaching them anything. It's if they, it literally makes no sense. But I think
from a developmental psychology standpoint, that's screwing your kids up.
And I think we as a culture have this really unique ability to pick out the extremes in a group.
Sure. Yeah.
And that becomes the stereotype of that group. And so we look at public school, and the stereotype is my kids are going to do drugs, learn about sex, and become hoodlums. And then the homeschooling one is my kid's not going to have any social skills whatsoever and be uneducated.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that both are, in essence, wrong.
Well, both are.
There may be a couple kids in every group that fit that stereotype, but
polar opposites.
Polar opposites, and any extreme is bad.
Yeah, I still feel like I have the responsibility to prepare my kids for real life. And as an example, right? My oldest has an individual that she struggled with at at our co-op or our once a week, and she was like, I am not going to. Yeah, it was yesterday. I'm not going. I'm not going. You can't make me go. I don't want to see this person. They don't like me. They're not bullying me, but they're making me feel uncomfortable. I'm not going to go. And I said, yeah, you are. And I, it was kind. I listened,
right.
Everything. But I'm saying, tell me, well, if she does this, what's your response? Well, and I training and teaching her to stand up for herself, to have a voice, to advocate, to, right? And this would have been the same thing if at a public school,
mm-hmm.
if she had the same issue, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's those life skills pieces, and it's not saying, well, yeah, you're having a hard time. We're just going to stay home tomorrow. Like, we could easily have done that, right? That was our prerogative. But I'm not going to do that because I want her to come out stronger. And so she went and, had this attitude of, I'm not going to let anybody walk all over me, assertiveness, and came home last night and was just beside herself excited because she did it.
Yeah.
Right?
And I think in my mind, if we were to push a wedge in between public school and homeschool and the pitfalls that we can fall into in both camps, from my perspective, it seems as if in public school, it may be easy to take your hands off of the process mm-hmm. of your child's development and let go. And obviously that is, I'm talking in more of those extremes because my wife knows several parents that are not that way,
right,
and are more of the helicopter parents. And then in the homeschool world, I think that there's a pitfall of being that overprotective helicopter parent, maybe a snow shovel parent. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
I think you could go look for anything anywhere and find it. Right?
So you're telling me that I'm just going off of confirmation bias?
Probably. Right, because I think it's just like anything, right? When we talked about depression or anxiety, we always say when you meet one person with depression, you've met one person with depression.
True.
I think the same thing's appropriate, right? You've met one homeschool family. You've met one homeschool family. And yet we meet that one homeschool family and we're like, don't get anywhere near me. You're eating kale and wearing, whatever, and that's our bias.
Yeah.
And you're right, confirmation bias. So we're going to look for it and find it. Same with public school. Like you meet that family where you're like, your kids do you really know what your kids are doing?
Right.
They're smoking pot and they're doing this and they're running away and they're not. Well, you've met one family.
Right. And
I think that's my take on life. And I tend to tick people off sometimes where I'm like, but that's true. You've met, it's anything, right? You can say you've met one Asian American, you've met one Asian American, you've met one white person, you've met one white person. I think,
totally.
And so I think, in a society that likes to group people up and then make a judgment about those people, we need to get away from that and lean in from a seeking to understand. Because it's funny, because when we tell people we homeschool, they're like, oh.
There's a lot of assumptions that they're showing you without having to say anything.
You look at my hair. I've got a tattoo. We don't fit that mold. And so ask questions. And so as we've met people, I'm like, you got any questions? And they're like, oh, yeah. And so we engage in a conversation.
Yeah.
But when I meet somebody from public school, I'm like, oh, great. How's your kid doing? What school do they go to? What's, what are their friend groups like? You find that engagement. But you've got kids in homeschool societies that are dealing with drugs and suicidality. And
that was me.
Right.
I did. I attempted when I was at private school, but that was because I started private school because I was suicidal and needed that extra support of the teachers and all that. But it all began while I was homeschooled and within that homeschool bubble.
So my thought is, what if we started treating people like individuals and understand their unique ecosystem and their unique culture, and have that ideology of seeking to understand versus making assumptions.
Yeah.
But I think the one thing that I worry about, and I'm going to lob a grenade in this one and just see what your thoughts are on this. But I do worry that as we go from more of that, the way that the forefathers intended government to be more of that local government versus big government, but as we see these moves towards bigger government, the government then starts to take control over the education system more and more and more and more. That kind of scares me, because you hear of districts and that are taking things out of the history books, to soften the blow, or to make instead of just reporting history, or Common Core math versus the way math should be done, or again, those are my biases, right? But as you see the government take over more, there's that potential for a public education to get more and more restrictive, at least in my opinion.
And I don't think you're wrong in how schools are taking on more of a load. And I think some of that comes from the decay of the family in our society. Yeah. And so individuals don't have the same support that they had during the time of our forefathers, where it was the norm to have parents and uncles and family that supported you and taught you and all of that. I also don't think that I have much of a concern because I know the kind of parent that I want to be. And so I know that I have the opportunity for my child to come home from school, whatever age, and talk about something they learned in class and to have a dialogue around it. Because, and this is some of my bias as well, especially from the community that I grew up with and all that I struggled with, because it didn't make any sense on paper for a really strong, healthy family to have a kid who is into all of the things that I was in. And so my bias is that you're going to learn about things somewhere.
Sure.
It's not like there's an option of not learning about something. You're going to learn about heroin. We'll just use that as a really extreme example.
Wow, that's a really...
We're just going to go pass over all the other things to something that's far enough out that... So you're going to learn about heroin somewhere. And I would rather have an environment in my family where we can talk about heroin than an environment where that's not discussed, and then the first place they hear about it is school.
And that's, I think, you've taken this conversation and you've taken to a whole nother level of it's not about public school or homeschool, it's about the family.
Oh, totally.
And we've gone back to this quite a bit in our different podcasts, but it's we don't have to abdicate our role as a parent, period. Now we've got to monitor, am I a helicopter, am I a snowplow, or whatever, right? But if we're being intentional, yes, it doesn't matter if you're going to public school, Christian school, private school, charter school, Catholic school, homeschool,
early college, whatever.
Right. It doesn't matter. It's just a vehicle for learning.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we've talked about this a lot, and it's so true in how I see the world. There are tensions between things, and it's not a tension that we should be avoiding. It's a tension we should be finding how to sit there. If you've ever seen those tight ropes or slack lines. My brother just got a slack line, and the slack line does nothing if it doesn't have tension.
Right.
It is it's just a piece of rope. But as soon as you give it tension, there's a lot of stress on that rope, and it requires a lot of balance and work on my brother's part to stay on the rope. But it's the only way that it's worthwhile. Right. Because otherwise it's just a rope tied to two trees.
Well, but also, and I think that's where we have to sit with the tension too, because I might be very strongly opinionated about homeschooling. right? Let's just assume that I am.
Sure.
But I have no right to go, you better homeschool your kids or you're going to be a bad parent. So you'd never tell me that I was a stupid parent because I'm not public schooling.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
But but the tension is having these conversations and going, oh, I never looked at public school that way. And you'd be like, oh, like that's how you view homeschooling and that's why you're done it, right? And so we have that tension of that conversation, but
recognizing that you have a different center of balance on the slack line than I do.
Yeah.
And that you may have some tactics for keeping your balance that I can adapt to, or that I realize, I tried that, or I know that's not going to work for me.
Yeah, and I think that can be extrapolated to any conversation in society.
Totally.
Right? I want to get to know your point of view and your perspective, but who am I to say, well, you're going to be a bad parent if you don't homeschool?
Yeah.
Because I've met people like that.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And, or like, you homeschool? Like,
why do you hate your children?
Or you hate your children? Are you stocking weapons to overthrow the government?
Yeah.
Like, no.
That's not quite right.
Right. But I think going back to one of our first episodes of how to have a conversation, I just really want our listeners to understand that this is just an example of a myriad of different other ways we can have conversations about things that we don't understand or we don't get. Like, there are some people, go back to that comprehensive sex education piece, like there are some people that are just up in arms about it. Mm-hmm. And I can understand why if the parent had no role. Mm-hmm. Right? But if you know this is coming and you have a choice to get ahead of it as a parent, right, then it really enhances your role as an active parent in your kid's life. Now, I honestly wouldn't suggest doing any kind of sex education for kids, under the age of maybe 3rd or 4th grade, but it has to be age appropriate. And that should be the parent's role. Now, if you're going to get this in school, great, right? Teach your kids the body parts by name and what safe touch is and what safe touch isn't. And, those are age appropriate conversations. But being a homeschool parent doesn't relieve me of that responsibility.
No, because your kid's going to find out about it somewhere. And typically, I think this is probably, I don't have statistics to show it, but I would wager to bet that most children learn about sex or swear words or something like that much sooner than parents broach the subject with their kids.
And their brains aren't able to comprehend it at certain developmental stages, so they just know names or things from their friends, but then it's how do we put it all together, right? Yeah. And so, right, just because you're a public school parent and they're going to get the education doesn't mean that you've abdicated your right or role to, right? So I think the bigger picture, we're so sometimes stuck in the minutia. We need to take a step back and look at the bigger picture.
Yeah. And have it center our decisions centered on the needs of our children, which we've talked about time and time again of active parenting. Right. Know your child and learn about your child. And as that happens, you'll be able to make really good decisions for that child, specific to that child.
Well, I've got, for example, the BYOD, the Bring Your Own Devices in District 20. I've got some of the leadership that are just fighting that because of what we know devices and blue screens do, right? But going back to the knowing your child, like you're not going to keep your child from something that you know that they need, but you're also not going to just give them something carte blanche.
Right.
Right. When I spoke last at a conference about social media and devices, I said, unless we prepare our kids to use this, and I pulled my phone out, I said, it's like giving them a loaded handgun. Right? Can a 9-year-old be safe with a loaded handgun? Yeah, if you've taken them through safety training and you've walked them through a bunch of things and they went to a class and all this kind of stuff, right? And you monitor it as a 9-year-old. Same thing with social media, but it's the knowing your kid piece. And that's the thing, that we forget a lot.
And just to clarify, we are not recommending giving a 9-year-old a
loaded handgun. But
it's an analogy.
It's an analogy, but if you're living in the South, you're like, oh yeah. No, I'm just kidding.
Take it as
there was a stereotype.
Well, I've enjoyed this conversation, and I'm glad that we've come to a place where I don't think that either of us was trying to prove the other person wrong or prove ourselves right. It was understanding where we're at. And I hope that as we can continue to model what some of these conversations look like about topics that tend to be a little bit more militant.
Mm-hmm. Well, it'd be interesting because I don't think we've ever really fought as friends, and so it'd be interesting if we could get a conversation down here where we get a little bit heated, but we tried today, and it just...
I'll start processing some ideas.
Some ideas.
We'll just
be able to show how that works. No, I'm just kidding. But thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for joining Candid Conversations. If you would like more information, you can email candid@mayfieldcounseling.com or call 719-452-4803.